My name's Anna Sampson and I'm with Stop the War Coalition. We're the organisation that's put on today's forum. And I'd like to just make a special welcome to our guests here today, who both of whom, is in addition to Tim, but Terry and Omar have travelled quite a way to be with us here today. So, of course, all of you would know Terry Hicks, who's the father of David Hicks. And I think that is a hugely well-deserved round of applause for Terry, because I think all of us here know how long the struggle has been, over 5.5 years, to finally see David brought home. And Stop the War Coalition, who's been behind that struggle for the past 5.5 years, is also very grateful to see Terry here on the eve of his son being back in Australia, that he's taken the time to be with us here in Sydney, as opposed to being in Adelaide, maybe just waiting eagerly for David's return. But of course, despite Terry being David's father, he too is unaware of the exact time when David will be home. And I think that's just an indication of the level of secrecy and the sort of hysteria that the government has decided to drum up around David Hicks's case. We also have Omar Merhi here today, and Omar is here up from Melbourne, and he's the brother of Abdullah Merhi, who was one of the Barwon 13. And Abdullah is one of the men that have been arrested, along with 9 other men here in Sydney, though in 2 separate cases, that are part of these so-called terror raids and terror cases that we're seeing happening here on our very shores. So I guess the reason that Stop the War Coalition is having this forum here today, we're quite fortunate in some ways that it's on the eve of David returning, but also I think it's to emphasise the fact that the campaign for David Hicks, and more broadly against the war on terror and the bigger picture to which the war on terror is linked, and that is the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, I mean, that campaign is nowhere near over. I mean, there are questions that remain simply about David's treatment in Guantanamo Bay. I mean, why he was detained for over 5.5 years, if the worst things that they could charge him with were hardly crimes that people would classify as serious terrorist offences. Why his trial was so heavily discredited, but then at the very last minute, a deal was managed to be stitched up that enabled him to be brought back, and what the terms of those arrangements are, and I guess most importantly, why the government won't let him speak about his time in Guantanamo Bay and through the imposition of those gag orders. But I guess the bigger questions around David's detention have to do with Guantanamo Bay as a prison and its role in the US's so-called war on terrorism and Australia's support for that war. So who are the other people that are being kept in Guantanamo? David has been classified as the worst of the worst, and yet all he's ended up with, it's quite a substantial sentence, and it's one that he should not have to serve at all. But he's been given a 9-month sentence for a crime that is not even a crime under Australian law. I mean, and who are the other people that are being kept in Guantanamo and the conditions under which they've been kept? Why do we still continue to have both the Australian Labor Party and the coalition government continuing to send troops to Afghanistan, to a country that is not benefiting in any sense from the war that's going on there? Not to mention continuing to maintain our troop presence in Iraq when other countries are drawing down their forces over there. And why the need for the war on terror at home? The host of legislation that's been passed in Australia to clamp down on civil liberties, and even to the extent of needing to pass new pieces of legislation, not only to deal with potentially with APEC, which is a meeting that's happening in Sydney later on in the year, which George Bush will be attending, to deal with the protests that will be going on there, but also to deal with questions of rendition and to pass specific legislation to deal with people like David Hicks and things like control orders, etc. The first person I'd like to introduce is Dr. Tim Anderson. He's a lecturer in political economy at Sydney University and a long-time human rights campaign here in Sydney. Okay, thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Anna. Good evening, friends. Good evening, spies. And welcome, Terry and Omar. As Anna said, the last 5.5 years not just been an ordeal for David, but Terry has been all through Afghanistan, Pakistan, the horrors of New York, and taken the effort to be with us tonight. Tomorrow, Adelaide receives Australia's most famous political prisoner in recent years. And the problem of David passes from being a dilemma for the US justice system to a dilemma for the Australian justice system. I want to talk about the problems that perhaps haven't been spoken about much, about the problems for the Australian justice system in David's return. But just briefly on the American system, 10 days ago a federal court judge in El Paso, Texas, released a Cuban American onto the streets. His name was Luis Posada Carriles. He was wanted for escaping from jail in Venezuela after bombing an aircraft which killed 73 people in 1976. The US is currently refusing to extradite him to Venezuela. He took part in the narcotics trafficking to fund the Contras in Central America in the 80s. He's admitted on American television responsibility for bombing a chain of hotels in Havana and other parts of Cuba, one of which killed a young Italian tourist. He was convicted in Panama in 2004 of an assassination attempt on Fidel Castro. So he arrived in the United States 2 years ago and was charged with immigration offences. Now, the Bush administration in the last 2 years has refused to consider him a terrorist. They've refused to extradite him to Venezuela. They've refused to use the formidable arsenal of laws they have in relation to terrorism these days against this man. He's walking free. And in the same month, the worst of the worst, as Anna put it, a young Australian man who was guarding a tank of the Army of Afghanistan 5.5 years ago is being branded as a terrorist by the corporate media in this country, by the political leaders in Canberra. And this is now passes from being a US problem to being our problem as of tomorrow. We presume David's going to arrive tomorrow afternoon. The first problem is, of course, that having been transferred under some international transfer of prisoners scheme, this country is receiving a person who hasn't been sentenced by a court. It's a charge that was created in October last year. It has no basis in international law. It's not recognised in our legal system. He's a federal prisoner going to be held by the South Australian government. But I would have imagined that if I were on David's legal team, I'd be looking at, and this depends on how David chooses to take the sentence for, really what is the sentence for one election, that he's been handed out, plus the 5 years in the concentration camp, let's not forget. But I would be thinking to challenge that, the basis that he's being held illegally in a prison, that there's been an action, a conspiracy to have him abducted, across a range of countries, of which the latest process is a transfer to Australia and to Adelaide. An agreement apparently signed by the chief legal officer of this country, Philip Ruddock, which, if it turns out to be an illegal imprisonment, not based on a court sentence, an abduction, it seems to me, as a Bush lawyer, that in South Australian law at least, that might be a conspiracy to abduct and illegally imprison a person. You imagine if I coerced someone to sign up a document giving up their liberty and agreeing not to be gagged and so on, and held them in imprisonment illegally, how an ordinary person would be regarded in that situation. One of the problems we've got, of course, is a corporate media that does not look outside its blinkers. Recently we saw some British sailors arrested in Iranian waters, apparently, and within 3 days they'd confessed to entering Iranian waters where they were arrested. There was a dispute over where they were, you recall. And within a matter of hours, the corporate media in this country was saying how preposterous their confession